Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In the year 1348, death sailed into Britain. It crept ashore with merchants and rats, unseen and unstoppable. Within months, villages stood empty. Church bells rang for the dead daily, and fear gripped every corner of the land. Streets once filled with life echoed with silence. This wasn't just a sickness, it was a reckoning. The Black Death would kill millions across Europe, but its impact on Britain was uniquely harrowing and transformative. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover how the plague arrived, how it spread, and how people responded in desperation and terror. We'll explore the staggering death toll, the collapse of social order, and the lasting consequences it left behind, from labor revolts to shifts in faith and power. By the mid-14th century, the plague had already carved a path of destruction across Asia and Europe. Originating in Central Asia, the disease traveled along the Silk Road, reaching the bustling ports of the Mediterranean by 1347. From there, it moved with terrifying speed, spread not by armies, but by trade. Merchant ships became floating coffins, carrying not only goods, but also infected rats and fleas harboring the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. In 1348, the plague reached British shores. Most historians believe it first arrived at the port of Baiae, Melcombe Regis in Dorset, likely brought by a trading vessel from the continent. The disease took hold quickly, moving inland with alarming speed. Coastal towns were hit first, but within weeks the infection had crept into the countryside and toward larger cities like Bristol and London. The true culprits weren't human, but stowaways, black rats, common on ships, and the fleas they carried. These fleas bit infected rats and then humans, transmitting the plague with a single bite. The tightly packed, unsanitary living conditions of medieval Britain created the perfect breeding ground for such a killer. As trade routes connected even the smallest villages to distant cities, there was nowhere the plague couldn't reach, and no one it couldn't touch. After its deadly landing in Dorset in 1348, the Black Death tore through Britain with horrifying speed. By the late summer, it had reached Bristol, one of England's busiest ports. From there, it followed trade routes eastward, creeping into the heart of the country. By autumn, London, dense, filthy, and unprepared, was engulfed. The city's narrow streets and cramped homes became a death trap. From England, the plague moved relentlessly into Wales, then north into Scotland, and eventually across the Irish Sea to devastate towns in Ireland. No region was spared. Maps from the time are scarce, but modern reconstructions show the terrifying efficiency of the spread. Within a year, nearly all of Britain had been touched by the plague. Mortality rates varied, but historians estimate that between 30% and 50% of the entire population died, millions lost in less than 2 years. Some villages vanished entirely. Others lost so many that fields went unplowed, and churches stood empty. The symptoms struck fast: fever, chills, vomiting, and the telltale buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes, often in the groin or armpit. Death could come within days, sometimes hours. Fear gripped the population. Families abandoned their sick. Priests and physicians fled. Some turned to prayer, others to wild excess, thinking the end was near. Contemporary accounts paint a bleak picture. One monk wrote, "The plague stripped villages, cities, castles, and towns of their inhabitants to such an extent that there was scarcely anyone left alive." The chronicler Henry Knighton observed, "Many died by day and by night, and were thrown into large pits in heaps." The scale of death was unimaginable. Funeral bells tolled constantly until even the bell ringers died. Mass graves became common. Whole communities changed overnight. The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis. It was a social, spiritual, and psychological shock that would haunt Britain for generations. As the Black Death ravaged Britain, it didn't just take lives. It shattered the foundations of everyday life. With entire families wiped out and communities decimated, local economies collapsed. Farmers died or fled, leaving fields unplowed and harvests rotting in the sun. Food shortages followed, sending prices soaring and hunger sweeping across the land. Markets emptied, shops closed, and the basic rhythms of life unraveled. Law and order began to falter. With constables, judges, and even clergy dying or fleeing, many towns were left leaderless. Crime rose, fueled by desperation. Some seized abandoned property. Others simply vanished into the countryside to escape the horror. Cities like London struggled to maintain control, but no amount of authority could stop the chaos. The dead overwhelmed every system of burial. Churchyards filled to bursting, and mass graves, some the size of small fields, became the grim new reality. Bodies were hauled away by cart, sometimes with no prayers or ceremony. In places, desperate communities turned to religious processions, praying for divine mercy. But hope often gave way to fear. Superstition flourished in the absence of understanding. With no knowledge of bacteria or fleas, people sought someone or something to blame. Across Europe, Jews were accused of poisoning wells and bringing the plague. Though England had expelled its Jewish population in 1290, similar patterns of scapegoating and persecution were echoed in fears of witches or divine punishment. In mainland Europe, groups of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of earning God's forgiveness and ending the plague. These grim spectacles reflected a society on the edge of collapse. Yet amid the devastation, unexpected social shifts began. With so many laborers dead, surviving peasants found themselves in high demand. Landowners, desperate to harvest crops and maintain estates, were forced to offer better wages. For the first time, many peasants could bargain for improved conditions, or leave for better opportunities. Though some rulers tried to freeze wages and restrict movement, the seeds of social change had been sown. The Black Death, in stripping society bare, had also given the lower classes a glimpse of power they'd never known before. The Black Death struck at the very heart of medieval life: faith. The church had been the cornerstone of daily existence in Britain, offering spiritual guidance, moral authority, and community leadership. But when the plague arrived, it exposed deep cracks in that foundation. Clergy were among the first to respond to the sick, administering last rites and comforting the dying. But their devotion came at a cost. Priests, monks, and nuns died in staggering numbers. Entire monastic communities vanished. In some parishes, there was simply no one left to conduct mass, bury the dead, or hear confessions. The loss of spiritual leaders left many feeling abandoned by both the church and God. For many, the plague seemed a clear sign of divine punishment. People believed the disease was sent by God to cleanse the world of sin. Sermons spoke of judgment and apocalypse. Some turned inward, repenting and praying for mercy. Others turned outward, looking for scapegoats, blaming sinners, outsiders, or even the clergy themselves for failing to stop the suffering. The crisis sparked dramatic shifts in religious practices. With traditional rituals disrupted and churches overwhelmed, private prayer and informal worship grew. Lay people began to seek personal connections with the divine, often outside the church's control. Pilgrimages, relic veneration, and mysticism surged in popularity. Art and architecture reflected the trauma. Images of death, suffering, and divine wrath became common in churches, carvings, and illuminated manuscripts. Skeletons, hourglasses, and dancing figures of death began to appear in once glorious spaces. Monasteries, once rich and powerful, crumbled. With fewer recruits and widespread death, many religious houses never recovered. The church's moral authority weakened as people questioned why their prayers went unanswered and why the supposedly holy had perished alongside the wicked. Though the church would endure, its hold on the people had changed. The Black Death had not only shaken bodies, it had shaken beliefs. And in the quiet after the storm, faith would never quite look the same again. In the decades that followed the Black Death, the social order in Britain began to shift in ways that were once unthinkable. The enormous loss of life, between 1/3 and half the population, had thinned the ranks of the working class so dramatically that labor became a precious commodity. Landowners, once in total control, suddenly found themselves in need of workers just to survive. And the peasants knew it. Wages rose as laborers could now demand better pay and conditions. Many left the estates where they had been bound by feudal obligations to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Attempts by the ruling class to halt these changes only deepened resentment. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages, and force peasants back to pre-plague working conditions. But the law was widely ignored and deeply hated. This growing tension finally exploded in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. Sparked by oppressive taxation and fueled by decades of frustration, thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding economic justice and an end to serfdom. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it sent a powerful message. The old order was no longer unshakable. The Black Death had weakened the very foundations of the feudal system. As laborers gained more leverage, the rigid ties of serfdom began to unravel. More and more peasants became tenant farmers, renting land and enjoying a degree of independence that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. At the same time, a new social class began to emerge. Merchants, skilled tradesmen, and prosperous farmers rose in wealth and influence, forming the early seeds of what would become the middle class. The plague, in killing millions, had ironically opened doors for the survivors to build new lives and challenge the centuries-old hierarchy of lords and laborers. The world the Black Death left behind was not the same as the one it found. In the ashes of death and despair, the seeds of a new society had begun to grow. The Black Death left scars on Britain that would last for centuries, not only in population numbers but in the very fabric of society. With millions dead, it took generations for the population to recover. Entire villages vanished from the map, and swaths of farmland returned to wilderness. The sharp drop in population reshaped the labor market, the economy, and social mobility, forever altering the structure of medieval Britain. Culturally, the memory of the plague sank deep into British literature and folklore. Stories, poems, and plays written in the centuries that followed often returned to themes of death, divine judgment, and human suffering. Grim imagery of skeletons and dance macabre, the dance of death, became common in church art, reflecting a society that had seen how quickly life could end. Even nursery rhymes like Ring-a-Ring-a Roses are believed by some to echo the trauma of the Black Death, though the connection is debated by historians. One of the most enduring legacies was the impact on public health. The horror of unchecked contagion led to the earliest forms of health regulation. Towns and cities began developing basic quarantine procedures. Plague laws introduced concepts like isolation of the sick and restrictions on movement, rudimentary policies that laid the foundation for future public health systems. The idea that disease could be contained through community action began here. Politically and economically, the plague's legacy was just as profound. The collapse of feudalism was accelerated, giving rise to a more flexible, wage-based economy. As peasants gained more control over their lives, they began to participate more in local governance and commerce. Over time, this shift contributed to the rise of towns, trade guilds, and a wealthier, more independent class of commoners. In reshaping the population, the economy, and the psyche of a nation, the Black Death became more than a tragic event. It became a turning point. Britain would never be the same again. The pandemic revealed the fragility of the old order, but it also ignited the beginnings of the modern world. The Black Death didn't just kill, it transformed Britain in ways that few could have imagined. It decimated the population, shattered communities, and left a trail of grief and devastation. But in its wake, it also forced change. It weakened the rigid structures of feudalism, empowered the working class, reshaped religion, and sparked reforms in public health. The very foundations of society were shaken, and from the ruins, a new Britain began to emerge. This was not just a tragedy, but a turning point. People adapted, survived, and rebuilt. The resilience shown in the face of overwhelming loss became a defining chapter in the nation's history. And though the pain of the plague echoed for generations, so too did the shifts it set in motion, many of which paved the way for the modern Britain we know today. What would Britain look like now if the Black Death had never arrived? Would the class system have remained frozen in time? Would towns have grown into bustling centers of trade and culture so quickly? History turned sharply in 1348, and the path it took has shaped us all.